Am I audible and visible?
You're loud and clear. Ready when you are.
I prefer verbal POIs. I wouldn't be looking at the chat at all. She, her pronouns. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, as a Malaysian, there's a perpetual cycle of lower class individuals suffering under their socioeconomic status. Government of Malaysia has done like everything to solve this by giving subsidies and stuff like that. So why are the low incomes still suffering? We think it's time to bring an end to these price controls and bring up the next stance and how exactly we're going to solve these issues. Moving on to like how we're going to set up this debate on side opening government. So firstly, what are like price controls, right? Price controls looks like regulation implemented by the government that puts limitations on prices on essential food items. This looks like subsidies. This looks like minimum prices. This also can be like a maximum price of items that are capped at the maximum price as well, depending on the situation. The framing here, the framing to explain the subsidies and why government is already like doing these subsidies toward the poor people is that the Malaysian government is committing to subsidy rationalization, which is already like happening, right? And the next step that the government should take is to stabilize like the economy and solve the problems in a better way, right? That's why we should end the price controls and focus on a much more better solution to like solve the issue of the lower socioeconomic status people, right? So like what is our alternative? Second piece of setup. Our alternative is we want direct cash transfers to people who are in need. And government needs to identify like who exactly are the people in need of like the lower income status, right? This is to prevent like wastage from happening. Well, because the current government like focuses on like blanket subsidies towards like not specified to a certain type of like people status or whatever. Then moving on to the first argument about like the nature of a Malaysian economy and why exactly ending this price control is like a better option, right? So firstly, understand that Malaysian economy always the Malaysian economy is like subsidizes its products and stuff like that, and it subsidizes it on a blanket term, which means that which means that they do not like target it to certain individuals. They do not target to like B40 only and M40 only. They target over the whole, which means that even the T20 are benefiting from this like subsidies as well. So this means that number one, price controls are like extremely unsustainable by the Malaysian government in the first place because of those subsidies. Secondly, this means that they're paying like millions of dollars for subsidies which are not specifically targeted to certain individuals. But the third thing is, once they spend a lot of money on the subsidies, it becomes very expensive to produce things. Like it takes like $10 million to produce like eggs and stuff like that. But in return, they're getting actually only $1 million out of the profit return in the end of the day, right? And not only that, does these subsidies benefits the rich people because they profit out of the business, number one, and they also gain a benefit from the blanketed subsidies at the end of the day, right? And this, in turn, increases the prices to produce, and it ends up in the government spending much more money to produce for products, right? So the second layer to this is extremely unsustainable because because then on in time, it becomes really hard for it becomes really hard for the government to actually like fulfill this rationalization, fulfill the subsidies towards the people on the ground at the end of the day, because it takes much more money to spend for these produce and to spend for these products at the end of the day, right? Therefore, it becomes we are wasting a lot of money in which we could do a lot more beneficial things, which I'll explain the benefits later on, right? And in the long term, it also becomes like unsustainable because it's not competitive economy, because only strong companies can afford to produce much more items, right? To produce much more because only the strong companies have the amount of resources and funding to produce those certain produce, right? So if if the produce or products were not heavily subsidized, then there will be like actual real prices of what it was meant to be introduced inside the marketplace. And this actually allows there to be a healthy competition between like the marketplace, right? It actually allows there to be much more competition between other companies, not only the strong ones, and actually allow people to have like much more opportunity to be working under these certain companies, right? So the third layer is, why exactly is our alternative better? Like why is cash transfers better? Because we are allowed to target certain individuals we are allowed to target certain individuals from the B40 and M40 class group. We are allowed to increase their level of income, which in turn allows them to make better decisions in their life, to continue their life, or get a better job, or even like to have their freedom on making like financial decisions in their life, right? Because they're not in time, they can then climb the socioeconomic ladder. Whereas when under opposition side, they're only going to be staying in that perpetual level, in that perpetual cycle, whereby they'll only be dependent on the subsidies, and they will never be able to climb the socioeconomic ladder because number one, they're going to be stuck in a low-paying job, in a low-paying job that never increases its wages because the government is focusing on the subsidies. Because when the point in which that government is focusing on the subsidies, they cannot provide higher wages for their workers. Because they are focusing their money on those subsidies, right? So what are the benefits that we can gain then? Firstly, government can spend on much more things when there are savings from the government, like targeting those direct cash transfers to the people in need. Firstly, they can spend much more on like healthcare. They can spend much more on like funding projects, and they can also build hospitals in like increasing the quality of our healthcare, increasing the quality of like education, for example. And this largely benefits the poor as well, because then in time, the poor can actually get a better way of healthcare and better way of education to also increase their status, right? But the second benefit then is we can introduce like the real price of the items, like I explained earlier on, because number one, Malaysians are not fully aware of the real price of the item. Therefore, then in time, they're always like continually asking why exactly are they getting paid low wages, because they see that the price is like a low price, right? And then employers will continue to believe that lower wages are enough to like sustain basic needs then itself, right? Because they always see the price being that low item price, right? So now when you introduce like the actual price, people will then on time like demand to the government to increase the wages of the people around them in order for them to sustain their life when the actual price is introduced. And therefore we can actually get better change for these people when we increase their wages, because then on time they can actually not be under that level of low socioeconomic status at the end of the day. Therefore, project propose.
All right, thank you for the fine speech. Now to invite the leader of opposition.
Test. Am I audible?
You are loud and clear.
Okay, that's good. Okay. Am I audible now? Yes.
You're audible. I don't think.
Yeah. POIs verbally. I prefer a POI from closing if you have any. Starting my speech in 3, 2. The life of an average Malaysian is already hard enough. With increased cost of living, inflation, closing off SMEs post-COVID recovery has made it hard for Malaysians to have a dignified life. The policy from government traps an average Malaysian to a morally reprehensible choice, choosing to whether or not put food on the table or choosing to do something else should never be a choice. It is a necessity that every dignified Malaysian should be afforded. What do we propose from opening opposition? The first is that we prefer continuous subsidies on these items. For example, sugar, rice, and flour. They will be priced according. They will be price control. For example, governments will impose a price ceiling that, for example, chicken cannot exceed in Malaysia. For example, 1 kilogram they cannot exceed 10 ringgit. The true cost, however, is 50 ringgit, and the government will absorb this cost. The second thing we will prefer is that essential food items are produced mainly by GLCs. That is to say, in Malaysia, for example, Bernas and Felcra already has a monopoly on the corporations that produce these essential food items. What this proves is that states are already involved in the decision making to ensure some form form of accountability mechanism to prevent these corporations or producers to hike up prices to an exorbitant amount where it's not affordable for an average Malaysian in status quo. I will argue later and frame in terms of how the Malaysian actually looks like, meaning how a Prime Minister did not set up the debate properly. But before that, I'll just like to few points of rectifications. The first thing that the Prime Minister said was that subsidies and it will give direct cash transfers. I'm going to just quantify how much of this money will help people, especially B40s. Because I think in status quo, especially Malaysian B40s have a lot of liabilities, like paying off loan mortgages, student loans, and they are living paychecks to paychecks, or for example, funding their side hustle. That is to say that if you don't have price controls and essential items, there is a necessity for you to live. For example, rice is a sustenance for you in order for you to keep putting food on the table, and it's not targeted. At that side of the house, you would have individuals to use those direct cash transfers to do other things, and this is a pain for them because individuals on the ground would have to make a choice on whether or not they choose to put food on the table or fund their next side hustle. Second thing the Prime Minister said was that subsidies only help the rich. I think this goes against how the Malaysian government is, because the Malaysian government has always been a welfare state. That is to say that when we have targeted subsidies, for example, like price control and government intervention, it is there to help everyone regardless of whether or not you come from B40, M20, M40 or T20 and things like that. But second thing, their only mechanism of how free market would work under their side was that they wanted competition. And this does not really explain how competition would exist under their side, because considering the essential food items in Malaysia like Pernas, who controls rice, and Felcra, MSM, who controls sugar, are already a monopoly, which means that essential food items under their side of the house, governments have to bear the cost on whether or not they want to break up this monopoly, which is more expensive for governments under that side of the house. The only form of policy that they would have under that side is direct cash transfers, which we quantify does not help the average B40, and price control and putting on price ceiling is the only form of solution to do this. The first thing I like to frame, how does the Malaysian economy look like right now? The first thing I think government needs to accept that we are a low-wage economy. That is to say that wages of an average Malaysian is low. This means they have less purchasing power and less disposable income, and also living in a high cost of living where the average bowl of mee Maggi or the average bowl of average can of Coke is really expensive. And inflation, especially post-COVID, is high and things like that. But the second thing we would say is that whilst they can say that we can hike up wages, it is untrue and not reflective of the Malaysian economy, because by virtue of the Malaysian market, employers right now in Malaysia, the primary economy and the driving factor is, for example, the agriculture sector and also factories or production factories. They are run by low-skilled laborers. Employers on both sides of the house are unlikely to hike up wages because they feel that we do not need to pay low-skilled wages as much, and it's hard to justify individuals to pay high wages to this because our primary economy is just based on agricultural and also production factors. But the third thing of all I like to frame how Malaysian economy looks like is that SMEs are too small to pay higher wages. At the point in time when governments force them to pay higher wages to give more purchasing power to these individuals, these SMEs cannot sustain paying high wages that will ultimately lead to their closure and ultimately lead to their demise. What does this framing prove? Mandating higher wages, which is the only mechanism to success from opening government, is bad because it destroys the Malaysian economy because we are a primary economy that cannot sustain higher wages. But second, it is difficult to keep up with rising prices because Malaysians don't have much disposable income to spend on things, for example, a bowl of mee Maggi, or especially in this context, to spend on essential food items. No, thank you, not yet. So there are two outcomes in this. There is an increased cost destroys the lives of B40, and the increase in RM6 ringgit means that B40 literally cannot put food on the table. And this is a moral decision that the Malaysian government should never take, because the concept of Malaysia has always been a welfare state, protecting the vulnerable. Like, for example, purchasing flour, purchasing sugar, purchasing rice are all means of sustenance that means that you can feed your family. But before second, sure.
How long do you think you can defend the economy from global inflation?
We can defend the economy from global inflation because I think the comparative under your side of just letting the free market is so much worse. We say that it's better to be realistic at this point in time and looking how the economy of Malaysia is. Price control is the best solution in terms of cushioning ourselves of the inflation inside the scope. So why is the comparative of having price control better? The first thing I would like to say is that the ordinary Malaysians that have low wages, that don't have to commit so much to get food. So on the outside of the house, what is probably different is that they have more disposable income to progress in life because they have more purchasing power. They will spend money to get education. They will commit to their side hustle because they can have more purchasing, because they have just by virtue more disposable income. The parallel to this is simple. The state in Malaysia subsidized oil subsidize oil so that people living outside of KL or Klang Valley can come into work because fuel is just generally cheaper. It's similar to how there's government intervention in our circumstances. When you have more disposable income, means that you can also spend more money into like upskilling and does not necessarily have to spend an exorbitant amount of money to just get essential items in ensuring that you can have a dignified life in status quo. But the last thing I would say is that there is a symbiotic relationship of these GLCs and monopolies or these production corporations with the government. Because there exists GLC in the government, for example, Bernas is a GLC, Felcra is also a GLC. The GLC's profit motive is in line with the state's developmental scheme. That is to say that they cannot hike up prices so expensive in order for them to make a profit. They have to also include what does the government want, because the government is the biggest shareholder, which means there is some form of accountability mechanism towards that end. The comparative on government is so bad because the government only incentive, the only incentive of this corporation is to obtain profit above all else. So now corporations under their side of the house would always want to make market and just have the plausible deniability to say that, oh, it is the price of the market. It is because by virtue of supply and demand that I price chicken, eggs, and all of those things because I cannot afford to sustain my business model. That exists less under our side of the house because we have government intervention to ensure that we can have a dignified life of Malaysians. So proud to oppose.
All right, thank you for the fine speech. Now to invite the Deputy Prime Minister.
Hi, am I clear and audible?
You're loud and clear. Ready when you are.
Great, just give me a second. POIs in the chat. Preferably from opening. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Billions of Malaysian ringgit spent on subsidies for the longest time. And this is the weighing that basically Taki didn't really want to engage with in his side of the speech. Because we all know that the Malaysian government spends so much on subsidies, which the money could have been used for any other industries that is beneficial. That is the point in which Kamila was actually trying to explain in her speech on investing, on using that billions of dollars of just using that subsidy money for other industries like education and welfare, which is actually integral to the development of Malaysia. It's actually far better than just introducing or just continuing the subsidies that we have for the longest time in Malaysia. It's precisely because for the longest time we've been having these subsidies in Malaysia, a lot of B40s and M40s are still struggling in terms of just like buying the most basic of necessities like sugar or even like chicken, precisely because in Kamila's speech already dealt with the fact that T20s are the ones that actually enjoy this form of subsidy. It's precisely because subsidy is just blanketed, it doesn't target to those who are actually in need. Most of the time, a lot of T20s are able to basically swoop in and take all of these benefits that left with the B40s and M40s to actually suffer because the prices of items are just much more expensive. The weighing in which you hear is so important, panel, because in order for government to win, they have to justify using continuous billions of dollars of ringgit in ensuring that people can just buy basic necessities at the cost of using the money for using other meaningful things like increasing wages for individuals. I think in order for you to push Malaysia to drive even further is for you to first give them financial power in terms of just increasing their wages and diversifying your portfolio in investing in other industries which can be meaningful for a lot of B40s and M40s. I'll give you 2 arguments, panel, and this deals with the cases that came from Taki. So Taki gave one case regarding how when it comes to just the market price itself is one that is bad because you're going to be succumb to the monopolies of most of these GLCs already. I'll give you an argument about how price control means that government has to basically take an incentive to actually be involved with it as well, which means that a lot of the supplies of these products will be lower and prices are going to be much more expensive. But secondly, Taki also talked about how most SMEs don't have the ability to increase the wages of these workers precisely because they're still small and they have to face monopolies. I'll give you another argument about why introducing real price of goods will give an incentive for people to actually, companies to actually, boost up the price, boost up wages for a lot of individuals at the end of the day. But one thing I want to take note here is in regards to just the mechanism in which, or the policy in which that Kamila introduced in her speech, in regards to just the using the targeted cash transfers. Taki gave you this idea that when you give them targeted cash transfers towards individuals who are actually in need, then you're putting them in a position where they are forced to use that money for other things. I think one, this is good because then you give the money to them and they have the autonomy to use it however meaningfully they can use it for at the end of the day, right? But secondly, even if it's true that, you know, giving them like some form of money will force them into making certain decisions that they don't want to do, at least the money goes directly towards the B40s and the on40s, which is actually just absent on the side of opposition when you have a form of blanketed subsidy. At least while giving them money, it actually increases the purchasing power, which is good in the long run because they know basically how to navigate what which wants and needs they actually can use for with the money that's being given to them. I think in this regards itself, it's just a form of win for the government for them to actually do this, because this is one way of you to increasingly and massively and significantly like alleviate the suffering of like many M40s and B40s at the end of the day. Let's take a look at the first argument on how price control means the government have to actually enter the industry. In regards to just the subsidies that exist in status quo panel, like states have to be involved with the industries themselves in certain instances, for example, like the creation of like factories for just sugar and chicken at the end of the day. The problem here, panel, is that now private companies have little to no incentive to actually involve themselves in such form of industries because they know they'll be outcompeted by the state themselves, i.e. because the government basically has economics of scale and higher forms of capital and wealth, they know themselves that they're basically going to have a small profit margin in regards to just like, you know, being in this industry at the end of the day. So altogether, panel, the problem right now is that once you have massive high demands of just basic needs, but you have lower supply because companies just don't want to invest in these industries, it means that a lot of the prices of goods are going to inevitably make it become much more expensive at the end of the day. So now, panel, when we actually, you know, just stop being involved with these industries themselves and just stop these subsidies at the end of the day, this means that companies now have a higher incentive to fill in that supply and actually, you know, contribute towards the economy and ensuring that actual individuals get to buy basic goods that is actually at an affordable price, which means that we solve the like issue on opposition by explaining a lot of individuals just don't have enough money to actually buy because the products are much more expensive. That happens more on the side of opposition when the state, when the government like continues to like, you know, overspend on the subsidies that currently exist on their side of the house. Before I move on, are there any POIs from opening? 3, 2, 1. Okay, closing.
Yes. Right now, the ceiling price of chicken is 940 per kilo. Can you tell me what is the average amount of cash transfer you're going to give to these B40 people and multiply it by the number of people in the middle class and why that is better than subsidies?
Okay, number one, if you look at the budget that just was like presented a few days ago, I think like Anwar Ibrahim already set like a certain amount of like number to be given towards the M40s and B40s on like the 1,000 ranges. But number two, it's much more probable, even though you're trying to say that there's so much of like M40s and B40s in Malaysia, the government have access towards its individuals and how much income they make, which actually makes it much more feasible for these states to actually give some like a lot of forms of like money to be given towards its M40s and B40s. But secondly, the amount is likely going to be high, as I said just now, precisely because the money that was used for subsidies are like up to billions and billions of ringgit. So when you like basically transfer the cash in a form of wealth of distribution towards its individuals by targeted cash transfers, I think it's probable for the states for them to do so at the end of the day. Moving on to the second argument then. Moving on to the second argument then on why like the introduction of prices of real prices of good like right now is one that is good. First and foremost, panel, Malaysians aren't fully aware of the real prices of good of like just chickens or just eggs at the end of the day, right? Which means to say that this causes the problem of a lot of individuals who have lower wages because it becomes a justification for employers to give you lower wages because they say, well, the prices of goods are actually low. Now, when you actually introduce the real prices of goods towards this individual, you have a stronger incentive for these individuals to cry out and like, you know, ask for higher wages. And this is a stronger incentive that will be absent on the side of opposition. And there are a few political incentives for this to actually happen in the first place. Number one, it's probably because it's a form of redistribution of wealth. Like the state itself has an incentive to actually make this happen to make policies that increases the wage of individuals. But also secondly, you get to galvanize you get to galvanize the voices of the people precisely because now they see the real prices. It gives them a direct incentive for them to actually pass policies that make sure that they have like an increase of wages at the end of the day. So they solve all of the problems the opposition wants to make in their speech to talk about how a lot of SMEs just don't have the capabilities to actually just pay their workers at the end of the day. Thank you.
All right, thank you for the fine speech. Now to invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Okay. My name is Shakir. Pronounce him. For PY in the chat, I'll take a PY from closing.
Shaki, before you start, can you test your mic?
Oh,
You sound.
okay. Okay. I'll just speak closer. Okay. The strategic failure in opening government to not deal with my first speaker's argument on monopolies will be their downfall. Because we argued the monopolies on that side of the house will continue to exploit the people on the ground, specifically because they're selling a product that is inelastic, where even if they sell it at extremely high price points, people will still buy food, people will still buy rice and eggs. Therefore, if you do not have a ceiling price, we argued in first that the price and the true cost of this food will skyrocket, that is impossible for the B40 to ever sustain. This is, and every increase in ringgit will mean less people get fed. That is the world in which they completely neglected. The way into this argument is very simple. The point in which when you are entirely dependent on a monopoly, you are dependent on the whims of Syed Mokhtar and Robert Kwa, this looks like low wages and higher price points. At best, at worst, there's price gouging, but at best, there's when you price it at high, you cannot sustain, like corporations cannot sustain this price like day to day. Therefore, they are forced to pay. They're forced to put the price of these products at extremely high rate. Let's deal with the opening government case. Their case is essentially we need to make money. Making money is good, but this doesn't engage with the Malaysian context. Let's assess the Malaysian government policy. Should states only focus on making money? Because if we did in the past, then we would live in an entirely capitalistic country where hospitals are funded by big pharma, and we would not have subsidized oil because that also wastes money in the long run. But we still do it as the Malaysian government because we are a welfare state. And this just points out the moral inconsistency on that side of the house. If it is true that they wanted to save money and cut costs in every possible juncture, then you will have to repeal fuel subsidies as well. They will have to stop subsidizing every, like, new entrepreneurs, old entrepreneurs. They would have to literally take away or like no longer intervene in the industries. This is an entire restructuring of the economy, which is a huge burden the government has to defend. This is moral inconsistency. There's moral inconsistency in OG's vision of public policy. That's why they're out of this debate. Let's be charitable, man. I think this is what CG is going to argue as well. For how long can we sustain the economic crisis, right? I think it's quite intuitive that states can get money elsewhere. We have recently imposed a wealth tax. We can have inheritance tax. We can reduce the wages of politicians like the current PH government. We can increase development and infrastructure the same way we escaped from the 1999 financial crisis under Mahathir's government. We can also have budgeting, right? Because that's how you reassess the economic growth of a country. All of these mechanisms and examples prove that we don't have to sustain inflation for so long. But the moment you raise price cap, when you no longer have a price ceiling, you deteriorate the functioning capacity of the economy, because before this cannot sufficiently engage, because they literally cannot put food on the table now. The second issue on OG's strategic failure, they argued, and this is the saving grace, let's have cash transfers. Firstly, we all argue that Malaysia has very stringent ways to qualify what is a B40, and more often than not, it outcasts urban poor. It outcasts students who are poor but not poor enough. It outcasts the low middle income households. So it's incredibly hard for us to quantify who's actually suffering and who is not. That's why the rational government policies subsidize absolutely everything. But secondly, food stamps are also unreliable, right? Because the market is still volatile. This response on this mechanism, this set up in Gov, doesn't engage with our true argument as to how the price of the essential food items will skyrocket the point in which when you no longer have subsidies. This is a strategic failure. They're no longer debating the real harm, the true cost of food. That's why they've lost this debate in its entirety. We're already winning an opening. Before I move on, I'll take a quick from CG. OG.
Yeah, justify the billions of ringgit that could have gone to other industries.
Okay, so then you have to defend taking away money from every other sector of the economy as well, right? Because you want to be very, you want to budget everything so efficiently, right? We like literally, as a developing country, we have never, and there is no developing country that gives that is entirely capitalistic, that lets the free market dictate all of these prices, because they know that at some point when the free market dictates it, there will be big pharmas and there will be monopolies that will obviously exploit the free market. Extension then on how there will be political suicide to the current unity government. And this is going to make it very hard for CO to extend, because we prove that in the future, you will have a worse government that doesn't have to fund the people on the ground, because this sets a precedent for all future governments to no longer care about the welfare of the people on the ground. Subsidies are the bread and butter of our economy. Fuel subsidies still exist even in the OG's world. It is historically something that Malaysians know will happen. That's why every time the price of oil increases by 20 cents, we rave on Twitter, we rave on the streets, because that is a huge cost to bear for average Malaysians. Secondly, this is also historically true. Mahathir subsidized everything in 1999 financial crisis, to a point where even if anyone came into Malaysia, we wouldn't know that we were actually in a financial crisis. But thirdly, we are in an age of reformasi. We are promised economic growth. We forgive the BN government because they made PH win in this unity government. But now you're literally turning their backs on every single voter that was hoping for this unity government, and saying that actually food security is not an issue because you should be able to fund yourself. This is harmful for two reasons. Number one, it puts the state in a very politically disadvantageous position, because your opposition, whose strongholds are in the B40, can now make it easy for you to get voted out. This is horrible, because now you have the Perikatan National Government that's like mudslinging you and saying that you are the party that has never cared about the B40, and this will crystallize every single government policy that exists in the Perikatan National Government if they get power in the future. This is a precedent, because at the moment, in our critical juncture here, where society has a emphasis on moral values or economic growth or the working class, the point in which when you, as a party that has just won an election, says no to the working class, you allow every other party in the future to also say no to the working class, but they don't suffer the political cost to this, but you do. Given that opening government also concedes that Anwar Ibrahim is a really good guy and has PH behind him, and they believe in moral values, you have to defend that in the absolute worst case when these people are no longer in power in the future. But secondly, the narrative against every other policy will be bad too. They will be seen as a party that starves the poor and doesn't allow any possible possible alleviation of poverty in the absolute worst case. What we prove here, panel, is number one, we've proven how mechanistically it is impossible for these poor people to survive in the world of opening government. But secondly, opening government and closing government eradicates future potential of our nation, because you allowed our country to be exploited by the forces of capitalism. For all those reasons, we have to win nationals.
Thank you for that fine speech. That concludes the opening half. Now I'd like to invite the closing half. With that being said, I'd like to invite the member of Gulf. Ready when you are.
Right, hi, am I audible and visible?
You're loud and clear.
Okay, cool. All right, I'm gonna set up my timer. Can I get a timer? And then, yeah, I prefer verbal POIs, preferably around the 5th minute to 6th minute. Yeah. So yeah, if you guys are quiet, I probably wouldn't realize that I've missed a few. So yeah, if you guys are have a very interesting POI, I can give it early, I guess. Right. What else? Yeah, no preferred gender pronoun. Okay. Starting my speech in, oh yeah, if I lag, please tell good touch or something. I'm using my hotspot and it's like bad internet. All right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. 3 ways I'm going to start in this debate. Firstly, couching what happened in the opening exchange, why CG is going to provide to you a different mechanism in comparison to our opening half, and why then we provide to you a long-term solution that cannot be doesn't exist on ops world. Let's begin with a few things, right? Let's begin with the couching of what opening half necessarily exchanged with. I think OG tells you that there is a need for you to repurpose this funding when it comes to, i.e., the subsidies, etc., and the price control, etc., towards cash injections. I think there is a particular flaw here, but we'll take it later. Let's then handle OO and why OO was to a certain extent kind of true, but also still doesn't tackle the long-term harms, right? Because all tells you, and this was important why my POI about how long can you shield against global inflation is very important, because they never tell you when does this perpetual cycle eventually end. I'll flag you when it is within my speech. But secondly, was this like assertion that breaking up monopolies are going to be difficult and that this is something that can never happen within Gulf's world. I think this is something we will tackle immediately. Let's go on to setup and framing and what is the mechanism coming from CG. I think the mechanism from CG is very simple. It's not going to be an instant end to price controls. The mechanism CG puts up probably looks like a gradual reduction of price controls. So it looks like instead of an upward trend on price controls in ops world, it should be one that is downwards and moving towards a gradual end to it on a quarterly or yearly basis, etc. So it's not an instant robbing of people's rice bowl. People are not going to suddenly end up starving tomorrow like OOCs. I think we're still rational and logical here. CG extension here is much more tangible. We think that the money put into shielding should instead be put to solving the biggest problem within Malaysia, which is the lack of supply. So we talk about the Malaysian markets and etc. It's oftentimes the lack of supply. So we differ from opening half here by explaining to you that instead of cash injections, we think infrastructure is much more important. Thirdly, what CG posits is a targeted implementation of creation of more agricultural zones and increased technological investment within already pre-existing agricultural industries. Why is this a far superior policy when drawn in comparative to opt for two reasons? Number one, that infrastructure in reality is much more resistant to inflation. That means where inflation continues to happen, infrastructure doesn't suddenly go away. This is something that's going to be long-term in nature and going to continue to apply within future processes. That means you can increase your supply, you can provide more supplies in the long run and they don't go away. But secondly, the infrastructure, because it provides a long-term solution to global inflation, can eventually reduce price controls to where it doesn't need to happen and people, Malaysia is able to supply like food just enough for the country in itself. Cool. Substantives and understanding a few things that are important. Market efficiency. Why market prices is something that cannot be shielded against forever, and the market prices is important. Markets are self-competent correcting mechanisms, panel. If you artificially control those prices, you are biding your time for collapse in the future. There's clear problem on up here because inflation is not a downward trend. Realistically, we don't see it anyway. Even they concede to it that it's going on an upward trend. Therefore, it only leads to a perpetual cycle of shielding from accurate global market prices of the products. That means on ops world, you can never truly like forever shield from global inflation. So what Gulf can posit, however, is that players do not become exploitative because markets are far more in tune with global prices, something that they tried to assert here. We think players don't become exploitative and try to make the most amount of money here. We think they will still be in tune with the market prices and global market prices, something that's important. But secondly, the inflation cannot be reversed at this time. So no way, no explanation where inflation is going to reverse. I think this still stands. But thirdly, and this is just to really put in the nail, right? This means that in 2023, as the budget increases, it also means that the trend would look like more exponential increase in 2024 onwards. So 16 billion will eventually meet up 20 billion, will eventually meet up to 28 billion. So where does the cycle eventually end? Cool. Improving the domestic market. Second substantive here, why price controls lead to incompetence in the industry? Here's where I tackle monopoly as well. A long-term solution is needed. Increasing supply forcefully via the implementations of policies, i.e. allocating land for agricultural products and forced innovation of these areas is something that's extremely good. I'll take you later. A lot more to see, bro. People don't want to invest because they realize that there is no profit to be obtained from these industries. That's the reality. Instead, they diversify and choose industries which are not price controlled or just export out of Malaysia. Why did our chicken go to Singapore was a question never answered by opposition when they wanted to talk about prices of chicken. The reason is because Singapore is able to pay higher for the chicken that Malaysia produces. So instead of it going domestically, it goes externally and internationally, and your chicken supply is limited within the state, and that's why prices are so fucked up here. That's why price control in reality, even though it's unintuitive, is bad in the long run. Because of price controls, producers choose to export instead of selling domestically. Literally, right? You cannot change the structures of like MNCs or whatever. They will still want to make profit anyway. This is far worse, noting that the Malaysian domestic market is small, and that means that the cost is controlled by like that. The producers will always need to meet these demands, and because it's small, they think if other markets can pay more and they're bigger markets, I want to sell there anyway. Why then is the third one, and here's where we tackle monopolies immediately. Why market is not absent of monopolies, and it's true. We think that Robert Koch, for example, is a big player in the sugar industry and flour as well. We think Malaysia's agricultural market, as noted by OO, is controlled by monopolies. That means that price controls is a short-top solution to the bigger problem in Malaysia, which is the monopolies. Correct for pointing that out. In terms of creating a more sensitive market or creation of healthier competition. So if price control continues, it's a blind side to the monopolies that exist and doesn't provide a long-term solution for this price elasticity. In fact, this emboldens and empowers these monopolies to become much more exploitative. This is especially bad when Malaysia cannot keep keep up with the price control will be inevitable. When industrial players find it as no longer sustainable, they'll fuck off from Malaysia and choose to diversify or focus on exporting instead. Right, before I move on to my next one, I'll take one POI from closing. Done? Opening. All right, clear.
Wages can't rise. All of the same supply chains will also not exist simply because we are not the same economy. How do you get all of your supply then?
What? That's the literal, like, that's why we say you have to increase supply, and whatever means of increasing supply will be applied. Right. On the flip, when ending price controls, what does this look here and tackles OO here on breaking monopolies? This is how you incentivize industry players to come in and say, come, there's a demand that needs to be filled here. Invest in our push for agricultural industries, come take a portion of the pie. This is how you break up monopolies, when you challenge Robert Koch's position, when you challenge like whoever is up there, right? Additionally, ending price controls will encourage competition and innovation in the food industries. When prices are allowed to fluctuate based on market forces, it encourages producers to find ways to reduce their costs, increase their efficiency, and innovate to meet consumer demand. This will lead to a more competitive and dynamic food industry, resulting in the higher quality products at lower prices for consumers. So what does the comparative look like in this debate, and what does CG necessarily push? CG necessarily push that the problem is supply, as noted by all teams so far. That supply needs to be solved. That if this solution to supply can come in long-term infrastructure as resistant to inflation, it's always going to be the best solution. Taking away price controls, where does it end? Where does it stop? We think we need to find those solutions. And so far, opposition doesn't find these solutions. They cannot run a debate. I think for far too long, West Malaysia has conquered the debating scene. Time for an East Malaysian team to take.
Right, thank you for the fine speech. Now to invite the member of opposition.
Yeah. Kevin, sorry. Yeah. Am I visible and audible?
You're loud and clear. Ready when you want.
Okay. Okay, I know it's a motion that no one expected, and the result of that was the shitty debate we had in opening half. What I'm going to do in closing opposition is 4 pieces of framing to really ground this debate. Firstly, price control does not happen in a vacuum. The $16 billion cannot be weighed out in vacuum as solely for essential food items. It is accommodating for bigger, huger considerations like maintaining a healthy debt ceiling, like maintaining a healthy population, like maintaining economy and food security. So if you were to synthesize the 16 billion to different areas, the money isn't actually that big. Number 2, we are a small market in Malaysia. This means the harm of subsidizing essential food items won't hit like $3 trillion like we see in places like America, China, Brazil, or Indonesia. 16 billion is probably one of the most we can see, or the increase will be marginal. Thirdly, price control happens all the fucking time by all countries. Why? In order to prevent inflation, in order to prevent shortages, in order to prevent COVID crisis, to promote affordability, or it's a general trend by market-oriented economies. It is not a problem, it's a general recourse taken by multiple countries at all points of time. Fourthly, in every single society, the middle class and the poor rely on subsidies, housing subsidies, food subsidies, education subsidies, healthcare subsidies, energy subsidies. These are all inevitable economic recourse for countries in order to provide access. I don't know why opening government's argument is reliant on subsidies is a problem. It is status quo. Closing government then, let me deal with them first. They talked about how we want to solve, firstly, the problem of the lack of supply. Where is the evidence that we don't have supply? We are a rich agricultural country. They have not given us any statistical evidence to suggest why supply is the bigger problem to deal with here. Second, they said there's a helping hand, invisible helping hand, and market will correct itself on its own. This probably applies for richer developed countries because their healthier democracy and accountability measures and natural incentives do not fuck over the little guy exist. I'm not sure why the invisible hand was something that's applicable here. The next thing that they say, it's wrong for us to supply to places like Singapore, but that is exporting. That's why we export food to Singapore, we export fuel to Saudi Arabia in order to diversify the industry, in order to get a remittance of cash, in order to boost R&D. I'm unclear why they just say don't give food to people. It's so not contextualized and so not economically viable. 3 extensions for closing opposition. I'll tell you why it's debate winning. Firstly, how this vehemently leads to the lack of access towards essential food items that is detrimental towards citizens. The first thing we need to note here is without subsidies, farmers will have no incentive to create food and people have no money to buy expensive essential food items. If farmers are producing less and less and demand is not changing, it will only become less and less and farmers have to fold because they cannot sustain the high cost of producing essential food items, but demand will still be extremely high and will definitely mean the price of chicken and eggs will skyrocket beyond the ability for people to access. But why is access towards essential food items of paramount importance? 4 reasons why. Number 1, on nutrition. Chicken, fly, and eggs are all nutritional dense food that provide wide range of nutrients such as protein and carbs, and it's essential for our growth and development and preventing stuff like chronic diseases. Number 2, food security. So producing and consuming essential food items like chicken and flour help improve our food security because by producing this domestically, we can reduce our reliance on imports and ensure stable supply of affordable and nutritious food for our population. Number 3, culture significance. Like Judge, Hindus can't eat beef day, kesian lah us. Chicken, flour, eggs are culturally significant in Malaysia. It's used in traditional dishes. It's something that's so accessible form of protein. Oil is so accessible form of catalyst of cooking. That's why that's the 4th reason that it's much more accessible and affordable for our population. All this means that the lack of access can lead to an unhealthy population because they cannot access this. And this is especially important in the context of Malaysia, where we don't have access to flora or fauna that we can consume meat from. We don't eat dogs like in Vietnam. Why is this argument and extension in of itself debate winning? We already proved why this is a fundamental right to access basic needs. Essential food items are necessary for human survival, required for us to function as bodies. They give us nutrition and energy. It's important for our sustenance. It's an injustice to take away. Principally, we've already proved why this is a violation. But second extension, why is this disastrous to the economy of our country? Into 2 parts. First, the direct impact. When prices skyrocket, we give the ability to validate other things being at high price. We already have the epidemic of other things being so bad. Like we have the highest inflation rate in Asia with current subsidies towards food. Now, this subsidy is also taken away. It'll just worsen inflation rate beyond repair. Our burden is not to prove how we repair inflation, but why we don't want to make it worse. Once it's already high, it's very difficult for us to lower the prices once those prices are already high. But the second part to this argument is that it'll hurt F&B industries. So these are not just suppliers like OO talked about, which are the big boys. There's so many people in between. SMEs, distributors, sundry shops, retailers, wholesalers, broker intermediaries. These are jobs that are filled by your minority race, your Indian and Chinese businesses that now have to close down until everything recovers. That's why in Cameron Highlands, so many vegetable farms have to be died out because they rely on subsidies. This is likely going to happen in large scale, and we don't have large scale capital by SMEs in order to insulate themselves. They have to fold and have to go out of business. Why is this so impactful? 3 impacts. Number 1, unemployment. We think more often not F&B industries have to close down unemployment, and this is disastrous byproducts of towards economy because you have to give more unemployment checks, it gives up more money. You have to give more social costs, more social spending, lesser tax revenue, lesser consumer spending, all byproduct from this particular harm. Secondly, we do not get the tax revenue and economic activity from F&B. About $50 billion we get a year from F&B, and that's massively more than just the 60 billion. Number 3, if this continues, we need to borrow more money and increase the debt ceiling. This will be nothing compared to the 16 billion money, and that's something that we need to actually possess. The point here is natural mechanisms for companies to bear the cost of producing essential items does not exist. Why? Number 1, companies are profit incentive. Number 2, in Malaysia, we don't have strong collaborative effort between governments and initiatives to solve economic problems. These are maybe pervasive initiatives in Singapore, but it's not here. Number 3 is corruption. Things like governments can change overnight, but politicians have deeper reaches into the pocket of society. Natural mechanisms don't exist. Why is economic harm something we cannot afford? And that's why that's a contextualization that we have to prove in this debate. Final extension, how will this damage the legitimacy of the current Malaysian government? We need to note that Malaysian government is just a unity government. It was just replaced by a relatively more corrupted government. We live in an uncertain political climate where 2 unprecedented events have happened. Number 1, the first unity government because we have no simple majority. Number 2, a Sheraton move where legitimate government was replaced forcefully by illegitimate government. In a very volatile state, at a very critical stage, where we want to make people as happy as possible, look at the evidence for this. Governments have absorbed tolls during Hari Raya. Governments have absorbed a lot of money for fuel subsidies. Toll prices are much lower. They literally have never been lowered since 2015 because the eyes of people are on the governments, and we want to make sure that austerity policies don't have a disastrous effect on the policy. What are the impacts to this? Number 1, if our political system is unstable, currency will drop and everyone's economic systems are significantly worse off. But number 2, it ruins our chances of recovering from diplomacy, FDI, import and export. These are far more pressing considerations over OO's argument that opposition can take over. Panel, I'm fucking handsome, this Baju Melayu. Come on, CEO should win.
Right, thank you for the fine speech. Now to invite the Government whip to close out the government's case.
Okay, just give me a moment. I need to go to the toilet.
Ready when you are.
Okay, am I audible? Am I clear? Because yeah, the internet is bad, like what site said. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, you are.
Okay, cool. Put it as a gallery. Give me a few seconds to set up my timer. Preferable POI methods will be through chat, but yeah, I'll be asking in the 4 to 5 minutes. But if I forget to ask within the 5:30.
Sorry, Ritesh, the audio is a bit soft for me. Is it just me?
Okay. Yeah, okay. So my preferable POI method will be through the chat. I'll be taking within the 4 or 5 minutes, but if I don't take within the 5:30 time period, please do interject me verbally. Yeah. Start the speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel. I'll do some things in my debate to actually box out what OO and CO has said, and I'll tell you why CG has won this case. Let's look at what OO has said. Let's do some couching on the opposition side. Let's look at what OO has said. OO has come up and said that Malaysians are already hard to live by. We agree with that. And now if you want to break up monopolies, it's more expensive, and the Malaysian economy is a developing economy that you cannot hike up wages and so on. But I think we don't have to actually bear the burden of that. Now, if you want to get price control, people will get more disposable income in their cases, and there is a symbiotic relationship between the GLC and the government and so on, and it's basically an outcast towards a global poor if you end price control and so on. But I think it's very easy to actually box that out in our case, right? But let's look at CEO's case in the first case, right? They come up with a lot of things that do not actually need to happen in the debate, such as forex, such as or even asking for evidence of supply of lacking of food, such as food security, such as the culture argument and so on. I don't think that is really relevant in this debate, but I'll also tell you why is it that they are out of this debate. But let's look at the whole case of opposition, right? That price control is very important because it's very important for the poor. But I already tell you that side has already told you that also can happen on our side, where we have gradual increase or gradual decrease into price control, which means that we do not go into the people's eating bowls and just touch all of the food all of the second. Maybe we take 1 grain 1 year or 1 grain 10 years, and then we actually make sure that they can also eat for the next 50, 40 years, right? That is what we take. We give gradual change towards the price control, and this is how we can also make sure that these people can also live by, right? Now, let's look at what CO and OO has come out. They come up and say that, oh, now you have price control because we can actually make sure that people on the ground can actually live by. We told you that this money can be, when you take off this price control, this money can be used for infrastructure. This is a more tangible outcome for these industries because you can use this for a long time. How long are you supposed to shield these people against inflation when, again, the money of the people is 16 billion? According to Malaysia's economy, 16 billion is a very big thing. We cannot use the 16 billion to actually compare with Brazil and Indonesia. What? Because their economy are bigger. But if you compare it percentage wise, it's a very big deal for us. So remember that, CEO, huh? Okay. But we must also deal with their case of monopolies and so on, right? Let's look at their case of monopolies where you actually, they come up and say that, oh, if you actually take off price controls, you actually, but we say, no, it's not true. In your world, monopolies already exist. Look at this guy at the back of me, Robert Koch. Look at Bernas. They are all monopolies in this country that actually control the food supply and control of this because of there is price control. When you take off this price control, you will have incentive for other people outside there to actually come in and say, come, We give you the place. There is demand in our country. Come and fill up the demand in our country. Now these people will be also thinking, okay, there is these people outside places coming. We should also make sure that we can compete with them. We need to actually go up in our abilities to make sure that we can compete with them. And I think this is very much possible. Let's look at what happened during the PH government when there was a shortage of egg supplies. Mat Sabu actually went to India to get eggs. And in 1 week, all of a sudden, Malaysian producers suddenly can actually supply the Malaysian people with eggs. I think there is already a testament to us that say that we can compete with the people out there. It's just that with all of these price controls that's happening, it's already, these people are taking advantage of the Malaysian people and taking advantage of the Malaysian government. Now, there is already enough evidence for me to tell you that there is a lack of supply in actually government's case, in opposition's case. Okay, let's look at what is this whole case about outcasting the global poor. We tell you that when you actually take out these price controls, there is already incentive for these companies to actually find ways to reduce their cost of productions. When you actually take out price controls, when governments are subsidizing for operational and production costs, these companies will see it, okay, government is giving me money for any form of operational and production costs. I can just do whatever I want. I can create wastage in my operational and production operations and processes, and government will still pay for me. Now, with this, we tell you that there is incentive for these companies to reduce their costs, operational costs, because now it's on them to pay. And now you also reduce wastage because now everything is on them to pay. If they want to actually not reduce operational costs, it's on them. They will lose out because there's other market competitors out there that people will go to and buy from them. This is how we are able to say that this is how prices can come down, and prices, no, later, I'll tell you later. Prices can come down, and also market players outside will make sure that this local place itself is already accountable. Now, you want to say about food security. I told you that just now Malaysian egg suppliers are able to fight with Indian egg suppliers. That's already a testament for us that we are able to have food security in this country. That's out of the case right now. Now, let's look at some comparatives, right? But yeah, I'll take a POI from OO.
Ending price control shocks the economy. It's difficult to sustain life in the gradual change period. How do you justify the millions of Malaysians who can't eat during that time period?
Okay, you say it shocks people, but we told you that it is a gradual change of price control. Again, even though if there is a shock period, I think people are able to actually make sure that they can, it's a soft landing for these people to make sure that they can also survive on the ground. Again, there is a gradual change because now companies can take action into making sure they can reduce their operational costs because now it's on them. I think that's out of the way. Now let's look at some comparatives. On our side, we actually incentivize other companies to come in, and other players, for example, even local players that do not have the access towards these monopolies or do not have access towards the industry because of all of these monopolies that's happening in this country. We gave them the incentive to actually come in and say, Robert Koch, I want to produce sugar. I want to do it better than you, and I will do it cheaper for you, and I will sell it cheaper than you. Now, Bernas, you say, now Bernas, I want to create rice farms and make sure that I can bring in IoT and agriculture into my places of farms, and I want to do it better quality rice, and give it to the people on the ground and make sure that they can pay cheaper prices for me, and so I can fight with you and make sure that the market is competitive. I think this is where CG actually comes in and say that, yes, we reduce monopolies and we reduce prices in the long run, but at the same time, we cater towards the people because now we have gradual change towards this price control policy making, right? Now, I think it's not, now on a principle level, it's just not fair for the government to actually bear the burden of these few producers that are basically owned by the rich, the T20, because they only have the money to actually come in and build all of this infrastructure for them to actually produce all of this, that are rich, because now you must understand 60 billion comes from people's money. Okay, people's money are being used to be going into these food producers where they actually waste this money inside. This money can be used very, very much way better than actually what is being done right now. 16 billion is a lot and it can be used better right now. And we tell you that it's a way that principally it's wrong for these companies to actually take advantage of the 16 billion or the subsidies just because they know that the government is actually protecting them. With that, I end my speech, and come on, CG win lah, come on.
Thank you for the fine speech. Just to remind you guys are using mic, please make sure it's closer because the sound is quite shallow. It's difficult for us to listen. With that being said, I'd like to invite the opposition.
Hello everyone. No preferred gender pronouns. POIs in chat. If I don't see you, you can turn on your camera. Yeah, that's all. Okay. The biggest problem from CG is twofold. First is that they are not contextualizing or nuancing all their analysis into the Malaysian context. And second is that their versions of solutions are very simplistic and childish. Just go to the monopolies and say, we don't want you anymore. Go to people and say, hey, come, people need chickens. And apparently everybody or anyone within the industry that realizes that agriculture is a horrible business to be in right now will say, okay, I'm ready to do it. Let's go. Especially when all the monopolies you are trying to break are heavily ingrained, not only in our political systems, but also in our economic systems, especially when we are living in a world of we are living in a relative government of corruption where we don't know how deep Robert Koch's pockets go into these hands. And you're telling me that the easier solution or the more likely solution is to tell these people to get lost, to go away. I'm unsure as to why A, this can happen, and B, people will listen to you, and see why this will eventually solve the problem, especially when breaking up monopolies is not the solution to reduce cost. If that's the solution, then oil companies by now should be very cheap, because we have broken up so many oil companies in favor of trying to, I don't know, reduce their power or whatever. But there are many other considerations as to why price can come down, and it's not simplistically done by simply saying we break up the monopolies. Bernie Sanders can do it because he's a popular politician with a big following. Gov Whip is just Gov Whip, like you and I, a regular debater from a university from God knows where. I don't think it's enough to show why that is going to succeed. Secondly, is this gradual change thing. First of all, I want to point out two things. What is gradual change? If it is big enough to cause, if it is a big enough change that will cause, if it's a big enough change that will save the money in the eyes of what CG wants, then all of our harms will materialize. If it is a gradual change that will not, that is marginal, i.e. if 16 billion, you gradually decrease it to 15. Next year, if it's 20, you gradually reduce it to 19. I'm not sure. They did not give a specific figure. Then none of the benefits will accrue because it's such a marginal difference. What is the, if he tells you 16 billion is big, what is 15 billion? Not big, it's very small because it's a huge one, it's a huge difference. And Kuhn already identified, even if you agree that it is a big figure, the fact that it is a figure used to cure so many different aspects of the Malaysian economy means it's worth it, especially when you compare it to the numerous amounts of costs that we have to do. Even in the world of CG, in the cost of getting to break up monopolies is expensive. It means you have to ask companies to either fold, or you have to ask companies to deregister, which is costly. You have to oversee so much of transition periods of where these companies move into the monopolies that have been broken up, and all of this will come at the cost of the government. Why would people say, government, why would Malaysia say, okay, come replace our monopolies and you will manage all the costs? And to be fair, our country is now going inflation and we have a relatively poor population. I don't know how you're going to manage, but go for it. And we are not going to give you any subsidies to help you start off your career as a factory. I'm uncertain as to why on all of these levels, these companies will still be able to A, produce a profit and replace these huge monopolies, and B, create lower price food essential items with no intervention from the government. Of course, that is an ideal world, but I don't think I heard anything from CG as to why this world is likely to exist. I think all the market optimizing sell chicken to Singapore has been well dealt with by Kuhan. Let's talk about opening government. Opening government, one last thing from CG. Then he tells you that the subsidy for operational cost is making companies create more wastage. Even if this is true, his solution is allow these companies to dictate by themselves how to reduce operational cost. This is a big tension from all of the material coming from government, because what government wants is to increase wages. They want natural incentives by companies to improve the wages of people, because they assume if things are expensive, then the natural incentive is to raise this individual's salary. But if now you are putting the onus on these companies to reduce their operational cost, the first cost that they will reduce is the wages of their workers, or cut down on workers completely and automate certain levels. So I'm uncertain as to why this is likely. Opening government, two things. The first is one thing only, cash transfers, about why this is a more viable alternative, because apparently it's more targeted. First of all, cash transfer will cost just as much because it cannot be targeted because you have no idea how much each individual is going to eat, how much of chicken. You have to do so much of vetting to determine how each individual consumes products and then determine what is the appropriate number. It may be too high, it may be too little. You may be forced to use an average that will either not do much or it will either do too much and cost the Malaysian government even more money. And this is why and it will not solve all of the problems, which is accessing nutrition, which is accessing and which is maintaining the F&B industries. For all of those reasons, I think Gov is out. Then the last comparative is opening opposition. Opening opposition does a few things similar, but ultimately here are the three key contributions that we take out. But before that, yes, OG.
Sure, the amount of cash transfers going to be used probably would be as much as like the money that was used for subsidies. But at least it's another form of like industry where you're diving into, you're giving them some form of welfare because that money can be used by them and they can dictate how much money they can use for other things like education, like healthcare, for example.
Okay, but we have educational subsidies, fuel subsidies, and so many other subsidies for these considerations anyway. Why are we making it so that it will cost more for the Malaysian government without solving all of the problems that we've mentioned? Your solution of cash transfer will not solve the impact towards the FNBs and the political pressure that you will face moving forward. Here are three ways in which we how we outweigh opening opposition. The first is magnitude of impact. If you listen to opening opposition, while the impacts may be skewed on inflation and similar to what Kuhan told you, he analyzed even further as to why the damage of inflation will cause irreparable damage to everybody else across many scales. While opening opposition focuses on big suppliers and probably the most vulnerable people on the ground, there are so many people in between, the wholesalers, the distributors. These are individuals that are now having to stop production because they don't contribute to any level into the production of these essential food items. They are just sitting ducks, hoping that things will work out so that they can continue their operations. In the event all of this breaks in the interim of you trying to recover, this means you are losing a large proportion of your economy from these aspects. Second is principle in and of itself. I think OO tries to argue about how people will feel affected, but it's a debate. They are always victims. They are going to be affected. But generally, the worst way in which they're going to be affected if it harms their ability to access important and nutritious food. Lastly is our contextual contributions that ensures that while we are a small market capable of recovering and we cannot afford expensive political mistakes that will harm our opportunities to create better diplomacy. For all those reasons, proud to oppose. Thank you.
Right, that concludes the final of MNIDC 2020. Now both all teams can cross the floor and which we shake hands and thank you for this day.